Welcome, Gunrunner.
When people consider failed consoles from major manufacturers, the NEC SuperGrafx is going to be one of the prime candidates. In fact, I'd argue it's the winner of the top prize, as not only was it a huge failure for NEC, but it directly followed on from the hugely successful PC Engine, and that's probably why it won my recent Amazing Facts poll with over half the vote share, beating the Atari Video Computer System, Nintendo Game & Watch and Funtech Super ACAN, as people seem to love videos on failed systems. Developed by the famous Hudson Soft and released in North America as the TurboGrafx 16, the PC Engine sold over 7 million units worldwide, with nearly 700 games released during its commercial lifetime, and it was recently re-released as a mini console by current owners of Hudson Soft, Konami. It also claimed several firsts, such as having the very first CD-ROM drive on a console and being the first system released in the 16-bit console generation, arriving in 1987, a full year before the Sega Mega Drive debuted in Japan, and 3 years before the Super Nintendo. The final announcement of the SuperGrafx followed lots of rumours and speculation about what NEC and Hudson had planned for their next-gen system, which I'll examine in more detail in this very video. But the thing that surprised me most about the new console when it was first shown in the summer of 1989 was how it looked. Given that the PC Engine was known for its small form factor, people were pretty surprised by the big brutish design of the SuperGrafx. It really couldn't have been a bigger departure, but boy does it look cool. Now I've set the scene and given you a brief overview of the NEC SuperGrafx, it's time to dig into the console a little bit deeper and reveal what went wrong in more detail as I proudly present 10 amazing NEC SuperGrafx facts. It would probably be best to start this video off by explaining what the differences were between the original PC Engine and its backwards compatible replacement, because a lot of people seem to be unsure about just what advantages it offers. First of all, the SuperGrafx has 4 times the amount of working RAM for the main CPU compared to the original console, which was a big boost by itself. But the main upgrade is the additional video chip, which also has its own video RAM. This is partnered with a priority controller chip, which allows the output of both video chips to be combined in various ways, including twice as many on-screen sprites and support for 2 independently scrolling background layers opposed to just a single layer, which is the reason why so few PC Engine games featured parallax scrolling when the Sega Mega Drive was flaunting the feature left, right and centre. The amount of colours, resolution and audio remains exactly the same, but these were already pretty comparable to the 16-bit Sega, so NEC and Hudson felt that no improvement was needed in these areas. The CPU also remains exactly the same to give it that backwards compatibility. So although the SuperGrafx was advertised as a 16-bit console, it still had an 8-bit CPU like its predecessor.
Whoa, that's super rad!
The original PC Engine did something that nobody thought was possible, dislodging the utterly dominant Nintendo Famicom as the best-selling console in Japan. But almost as soon as the NEC console achieved that amazing feat, a new threat loomed on the horizon, the first truly 16-bit console in the form of the Sega Mega Drive, which was launched in October 1988, exactly 1 year after the PC Engine first debuted. The announcement of the Mega Drive left NEC and Hudson scrambling. Although Sega had failed to grab hold of the Japanese market with either the SG-1000 or Master System, they had done well in other parts of the world and were arguably the biggest arcade company in the world at that point, and it would be hard to compete with that kind of pedigree. With NEC and Hudson running scared at the thought of Sega becoming the new market boss, their only option was to accelerate the development of the PC Engine's successor, which would no doubt lead to corners being cut. The SuperGrafx was originally scheduled to be released in 1990, but the impending threat of the Mega Drive saw its release brought forward at least 6 months, with it hitting retail shelves in December 1989 instead, just in time for the important Christmas sales period. But December really was a bit too late to make an impact. Most people had already bought their present by then, or indeed planned what they were going to buy, and an upgraded console with no games wasn't going to change their mind. And that leads us on to the second problem. The rush to get the console to market meant that only one SuperGrafx game was ready for launch: Battle Ace, a lackluster clone of Sega's G-Lock that was actually intended for use with the unreleased Power console, but more on that later. NEC literally offered no reasons to buy a much more expensive console over the regular PC Engine, and it really is no surprise to learn that the console failed so badly when you consider the mess NEC made of the launch. And it turns out that NEC and Hudson didn't really have anything to worry about, because the PC Engine continued to be a success whilst the Mega Drive failed to grip Japanese audiences, and it would be Nintendo that would claw the market back with the release of the Super Nintendo in 1990.
Whoa, that's super rad!
And this segment leads on very nicely from the last one and offers up an alternative timeline that may well have seen NEC keep hold of the Japanese console market for good and not only stave off the imminent threat of Nintendo, but also the future threat of Sony and their PlayStation. You see, in the same year that the SuperGrafx arrived, Sega's great arcade rivals Namco announced that they were also releasing a 16-bit console of their own that they would call the Super System. As well as the arcades, Namco had also been impressing PC Engine audiences too, of course, with wonderful conversions of games like Dragon Spirit, Galaga 88, Splatterhouse, Final Lap Twin and Pac-Land, so they already had a very good relationship with NEC and Hudson, having recently fallen out with Nintendo over their restrictive licensing practices. Namco were keen to give Nintendo a bloody nose, but also wanted to keep their new friends on side. The Namco Super System would be based on their own System 21 arcade hardware, and vague reports of this new hardware started to appear in American magazines such as GamePro and EGM around this same time too. Pending for a 1989 release, this new console promised far better specifications than both the Super Nintendo and Sega Mega Drive, but just as Namco were ready to unveil their new system to an expectant world, they bottled it. Namco were worried that it would struggle to find its place in an already crowded market that would become dominated by Sega, Nintendo and of course NEC. So rather than just cancel it completely, they decided to cozy up to NEC once more and give them the chance to beat the big two. Knowing that the PC Engine was now getting surpassed technologically by rival systems, they pitched the Super System as its replacement, and for a while at least, NEC were very interested indeed. But what Namco didn't bank on was PC Engine creators Hudson Soft throwing a spanner in the works. Once they got word of these plans, they felt understandably threatened by the arcade giant, and were worried that NEC would write them out of the equation completely and buddy up with Namco instead. With an agreement already in place to provide new PC Engine hardware, Hudson rushed the design of their own successor, the SuperGrafx, so NEC would cancel any further talks with Namco and continue on their existing console path with Hudson. So what became of the Super System then, I hear you ask? Well, nothing really. Namco just forgot about it and never talked about the idea of releasing their own console ever again. They did get the last laugh against Nintendo though eventually, as in 1994 they partnered up with Sony to provide some big name launch titles for the PlayStation, which was of course the result of Sony's own fallout with Nintendo. And we all know how that turned out, don't we? Revenge is sweet, as they say.
Whoa, that's super rad!
There's no doubting that despite its huge failure in the market, the SuperGrafx is one of the most high profile consoles to never make it to the West. But I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that there were intentions to do so, with both American and UK magazines announcing that it was going to be released in their respective territories during 1990. Indeed, the name of the console is actually somewhat of a giveaway of NEC's intentions, because as most people will know, the PC Engine was renamed the TurboGrafx for the West, so calling the new console the SuperGrafx gave it instant name recognition in that part of the world. but you do have to wonder if going with the westernised name from the start costs the console in its homeland, because without knowing, you probably wouldn't have associated it with the PC Engine at all, which obviously sounds radically different. It also had the larger, more brutish looks of the TurboGrafx 2, a very American muscle car-like design, a far cry from the cute miniaturised form of the PC Engine. Of course, it was the failure of the SuperGrafx in Japan that saw a Western release cancelled. Then you also have to remember that the TurboGrafx was already struggling in North America anyway, not experiencing anywhere near the amount of success as it had done back home. And then we have the case of the UK and Europe, which is a whole other story altogether, but I won't go over all of that again here, as I have actually made a standalone video about it, which I've linked down below.
Whoa, that's super rad!
As well as announcing the console itself, NEC also revealed 2 new add-ons for the SuperGrafx 2, which they revealed would be ready for launch, with both offering an exciting new way to play games on your SuperGrafx system. I will cover the second one later in this video, but in this segment I'll talk about the first one, the impressive sounding Power Console. The NEC Power Console might sound like a system of its own, but it was actually a new type of controller that you could use instead of your traditional turbo pad. However, the Power Console was designed to slide over the entire console and lock into it, very much making it look like a new system altogether. It featured a full flight yoke, throttle and keypad to give you a wide range of new gameplay options, not to mention different types of games to make use of it, such as flight simulators and racing games. Indeed, the SuperGrafx launch game Battle Ace was originally supposed to be the game that would be included with the add-on to show off its capabilities. Unfortunately, the Power Console was never released. There are actually 2 separate reasons for this. Firstly, NEC discovered that the unit would be extremely costly to produce, and even more so expensive to retail, especially if you included a game with it. This led to them holding off on putting it into production until they had built up a decent amount of users who would be willing to buy one. And then when the SuperGrafx flopped really badly, the Power Console was quietly cancelled. There are a few prototypes of the unit out there, which are presumably the ones shown at expos and in magazines, and these remain a true holy grail item for all PC Engine collectors.
Whoa, that's super rad!
Earlier on in this video I mentioned that the SuperGrafx only launched with one game, Battle Ace, and how a large amount of this was down to the console being rushed to market to try and stop NEC losing ground to Sega. But now it's time to investigate if the game situation improved. Spoiler alert, it didn't, as the title of this segment probably gave away already. It still shocks me to know that the SuperGrafx only had 5 actual games in total, plus a further PC Engine game that had small improvements when played on the revised hardware. I already talked about that one launch game, Battle Ace, and I mentioned that it was a rather lacklustre clone of the Sega arcade game G-Lock. But what came next, I hear you ask? Good question, because in 1990 we got a further 3 games, yep, just 3 games in a whole year. The star of the show was undoubtedly a port of the popular Capcom arcade game Ghouls and Ghosts, which is very impressive indeed and widely regarded as the best game on the SuperGrafx. Then we had Mado King Granzort, a pretty average arcade adventure based on the anime of the same name. And last of all was Darius Alpha, another arcade port, this time the stunning triple screen shoot 'em up by Taito. Rather bizarrely, this one was only offered to those who had already bought both the CD and HuCard versions of Darius Plus, which makes absolutely no sense at all considering how similar those 2 versions are. However, the standard PC Engine version of Darius was exactly the same game and would still have the minor improvements when played on the SuperGrafx, and featured a special PC SG logo on the box to signify this. The only PC Engine game to do so, despite loads more being promised by NEC and Hudson. Then in 1991 we had the final 2 SuperGrafx games, another Capcom coin-op conversion in the form of 1941 Counterattack and Aldinez, another shoot 'em up, but one that was created exclusively for the SuperGrafx by Hudson Soft. So out of those 6 games, 4 were shoot 'em ups. Such a diverse library, eh? I suppose it does help enforce the view that the PC Engine is the best console for hardcore shmup fans. Several more announced games, including a port of Strider, were repurposed for the PC Engine arcade CD-ROM format so they would gain a larger audience. But before I finish this segment, I do have to add that the situation isn't quite as bad as it seems, because there are actually some SuperGrafx homebrews out there that can be downloaded and played from a Turbo EverDrive. Firstly, there's RT2A, another vertically scrolling shooter with some really impressive parallax effects. SGX Alpha, which is pretty similar but less polished, a port of R-Type from the PC Engine that fixes things like the sprite flicker and the levels being split across two hue cards, and some work in progress demos of popular games from other machines, including Konami's SNES exclusive shooter Axelay, Super Famicom RPG Tengai Meikyo Zero, and impressive Neo Geo arcade adventure Magician Lord, which I really hope gets finished.
Whoa, that's super rad!
In my mind, one of the most bizarre facts about the SuperGrafx is the way it was totally forgotten by both Hudson and NEC, almost completely erasing its existence. I mean, yes, I know it was a total failure, but it seems that they went out their way to forget it, even when it could have benefited them. And I say this because NEC would release a multitude of more advanced PC Engine based systems after the release of the SuperGrafx, but none of them were compatible with its games, which seems quite bizarre, with the main candidates being the PC Engine Duo and its follow-ups, the Duo R and Duo RX, which, if you don't know, are all-in-one consoles containing both the PC Engine and CD-ROM add-on, with a built-in system card. Given these were very much designed as premium models, where price wasn't really a factor, it seems incredibly short-sighted not to have added SuperGrafx compatibility too. Likewise with the PC Engine add-on pack for the Pioneer Laser Active, which I've talked about a great deal in my Amazing Facts episode on that innovative but ultimately totally unaffordable system. However, despite NEC and Hudson's attempts to delete the machine from history, the modern owners of Hudson Soft, and indeed all the PC Engine IP, Konami, weren't so quick to dismiss it when they created a mini version of the console in 2020. There are two SuperGrafx games that are included on all three versions of the unit: Hudson's own exclusive game Aldernez and the wonderful port of Capcom's Ghouls and Ghosts 2, which are both wonderful additions to an already strong game selection.
Whoa, that's super rad!
If you've been following the retro gaming scene closely over the last few years, and especially the world of emulation consoles, then I'm sure you'll be well aware of the Analog Pocket, an FPGA based handheld that offers perfect Nintendo Game Boy compatibility with real cartridges and the advantages of a modern backlit screen. You'll probably also know that shortly after the handheld's release, they also made special adapters available that would allow you to play Atari Lynx, Sega Game Gear, Neo Geo Pocket and PC Engine games, giving it compatibility with all the major handhelds that competed with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color too. The PC Engine part is of course down to the release of the PC GT, or if you're in North America, the Turbo Express, an awesome but very expensive portable PC Engine. But the programmers at Analog actually went one better and added compatibility for the SuperGrafx to the Pocket handheld too. The SuperGrafx FPGA core was also made available for free to download so people could update the firmware on their own devices. Very cool indeed. So the NEC SuperGrafx doesn't just live on in the present day thanks to the excellent PC Engine Mini, it also lives on through the awesome Analog Pocket too.
Whoa, that's super rad!
Now, earlier on in this video I talked about the announced but ultimately unreleased Power Console add-on for the SuperGrafx, but there was actually a second add-on too, which also went unreleased in the form of the SuperGrafx CD-ROM. But in this particular case, NEC offered a somewhat bulky and rather convoluted solution instead. You see, NEC did actually offer an initial way to use the existing PC Engine CD-ROM drive with the new console while people waited for the new version of the add-on to arrive. But this was less than ideal. Now you might remember me talking about the much more bulky design of the SuperGrafx in the intro, especially when compared to the extremely petite PC Engine, and this was the main problem here, because it stopped you being able to connect the CD drive in the usual way, and there was no way it could be incorporated into the clever suitcase-like package that already existed. So the solution was a new interface unit called the RAU30, catchy name I'm sure you'll agree. The unit came in two parts and was actually larger than the original PC Engine itself. You had a small shuttle-like grey connector that slotted into the back of your SuperGrafx that had a cable coming out the back that went into a white box that was the size of the original console, so it could be plugged into the CD-ROM 2 interface unit. This had to be the most ridiculously bulky and bizarre add-on ever created, even if it did ultimately allow you to use PC Engine CD games on your SuperGrafx. I mean, look at the mess sprawled across your desk. With these photos courtesy of the excellent Nicole Express blog, and I've linked that down in the description, which contains lots of excellent technical info about this add-on too. You have to marvel at the utter stupidity of having a CD add-on that had absolutely no software released for it at all. Absolutely none, and only allowed you to play games from the previous console. So it's fair to say that not many people even took up this option, and these RAU30 add-ons are now extremely hard to find. In all honesty, you're better off getting a Turbo Duo if you want to play the wonderful catalogue of original PC Engine CD games.
Whoa, that's super rad!
I felt it was important to finish this video by telling you what NEC and Hudson did next, as the failure of the SuperGrafx hit them hard, and they really wanted to redeem themselves, and in 1992 they announced the 32-bit Tetsujin, meaning Iron Man, to expectant ears. Now I already know what you're thinking, 1992? Don't you mean 1994? And no, I definitely mean 1992, because that was when the console that eventually became the PCFX was supposed to come out. Yep, you heard that right, the new 32-bit NEC console was 2 years late. This fact still staggers me, and once you understand that fact, you can already understand why this console also failed to take the Japanese market by storm. And I also know what you're now thinking, how did this happen? Well, let's look at what caused this delay in a bit more detail. So let's go right back to 1990, after the release of the SuperGrafx, with NEC Electronics and Hudson Soft sitting down to plan out their next console. As before, Hudson would create the new hardware design and NEC would do all the manufacturing, but this time NEC would have a bit more input into this, suggesting several ideas to Hudson based around powerful new processors that they were developing at that time. They proposed a completely new 32-bit console with full screen video playback, which was all the rage at this time, a huge, for then, 2MB of RAM and a CD-ROM drive. Hudson liked this idea and they pushed forward with the final design. By 1992, NEC had a prototype they could show to the press, as well as potential developers. Hudson had created a special version of their Star Soldier game that used full motion video backgrounds to show off what this new hardware was capable of. Reception to it was quite positive, but it was clear that they would miss their proposed late 92 release date, as there was no other software ready. NEC decided to push the debut of the Tetsujin back to mid-93 and asked Hudson to work on more games whilst they tried to get more developers on board. But the continued success of the PC Engine also got in the way of this, as Hudson was stretched into trying to develop games for both. This pushed the release back again to late 93, hoping to get it out in time for the lucrative Christmas market. But in the meantime, a host of new consoles were both announced and released, including the Atari Jaguar, Amiga CD32, 3DO and FM Towns Marty, not to mention the promise of even more around the corner like the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. NEC's new hardware was now looking very dated in comparison, and they had to decide what to do. They went from being the company that would launch the 32-bit console generation to just another contender. NEC knew that they didn't have enough time to redesign the Tetsujin, so just made some minor improvements to the hardware, such as a faster, more powerful processor, and also put it into a PC-like tower case. They also changed the name to the PCFX, hoping to capitalise on the connection to their hugely successful PC Engine, even though it wasn't actually backwards compatible, unlike the SuperGrafx. But by the time it was ready for release, it was another year later, and the PCFX didn't hit the market until December 1994, putting it in a very tough position indeed. The machine was ridiculed by the Japanese press of the time, with many comparisons made to the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn on a hardware level, and widespread criticism of its full motion video focused games, which had fallen out of favour by then. NEC had already cancelled the planned Western release of the console, knowing it could never compete, and decided to make the system as Japan-centric as possible, hoping to form a niche. As it turned out, this niche would end up being soft porn, with hentai games proving to be the console's biggest draw, not what Hudson had intended at all, causing them to break off their relationship with the NEC. Although it's still very much considered a failure, it did somehow manage to sell 400,000 units off the back of this, had over 60 games released for it, and managed to stay on the market for nearly 4 years, not being officially discontinued until April 1998. It would prove to be NEC's last console, and a sad end to a very interesting legacy.
Next! Do it!
그 애니메이션 게임 마신 TCFX.
The game is FX.
NEC.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing NEC SuperGrafx facts. But which of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or are there any other tantalising tidbits of trivia that you want to share? I always love to hear the thoughts of you as my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube members for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges: D. Vaughan, Albert Davis, Richard Baker, Martin Wiggins, Peter Grantham, Bernard Santu, Mins, Classic Gamer 74, Josh Hartman, Daniel Skronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsune, Grady Haynes, Paul Daniel, Seth A. Robinson, Climatorn, Carl Olsen, Mark Strickland, Big Chuzzle, Gold Cloping, Black Siren, John Alberino, Krispy Kreme, Justin Cooney, Luke Boynton, Sarah B, Richard Tate, Tellboy 2011, Tiago Silva, James Welch, Wesley K, Hunter Bungay, Cellphone Smartphone, Glacier 9 and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support this channel, you can now join as a member of as little as £2 a month, where you'll get access to exclusive videos and updates and much more besides. Just click the button on my community page to get started. My Patreon is also still available if you prefer to support me in other ways too. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, I'll see you all again for another video very soon.